Welcome to Watches with Dennis, and today I want to do another market examination, this time comparing three luxury watches, the Patek Nautilus 5711 1A-010, the Audemars Piguet or AP Royal Oak. The reference number here is 15450ST.00.1256ST.03, and the Rolex Daytona, the reference 116500LN. And we're going to compare those to the S&P 500, and we're going to go back pre-pandemic. So my date range here is going to be January of 2019 through where we are at. The numbers in terms of the value of the watches this time actually comes from Chrono 24. So these are either, in the case of the Rolex Daytona, what they list the new ones going for, and then in the case of the Royal Oak and the Nautilus, the unworn pricing. It's important to note when we're using Chrono 24 that this is a marketplace that in a lot of cases tends to run a bit higher than other venues. It's very dealer dominated. So this is not the same pricing that you would necessarily expect to pay in a private transaction to transaction. And some of this will also be reflected by the fact that all of these are to be unworn pieces in terms of the pricing. So as you might expect, those prices tend to run higher than prices of used models. Now, here's the first chart I wanted to show everyone. And don't worry, we're not going to stay on this one very long because this one is difficult to read. But you can see the x-axis. We've got all of our dates represented there. The y-axis has two different versions. The left-hand side shows the value of the line graphs. And the line graphs are our watches. So the Nautilus is in blue, the Daytona is in gray, and the Royal Oak is in orange. Then the yellow columns that you see are the S&P 500 monthly averages, but do not read those against the left-hand y-axis. Use the right-hand y-axis for those. So you can see the S&P 500 is mostly operating in this sort of $3,000 to $5,000 range roughly for our time period. And then in terms of the watches, the reason why it's so hard to read is the Royal Oak and the Daytona are trading for significantly less money than the Nautilus has. So to just give some additional context, the S&P 500 in January 2019 was approximately $2,607. It's currently about $4,175. It's actually lower than that. This $4,175 is from the start of May, not the end of May, but I'm doing monthly snapshots, so I didn't want to interfere with that. Then in terms of the watches, if you look at that gray line, the smallest line, that's the Rolex Daytona. January 2019, that watch was going on Chrono 24 new for approximately $20,729. And it's currently going for $45,807. It has started to see a dip. We'll have another graph that will show that better in a moment. The next highest line is the AP Royal Oak. It actually started the series lower than the Daytona 116-500LN at $18,845. So that's why you can't really see the line very well at first, but it starts to pull away as time has gone by. And the Royal Oak as of May 2022 was $74,700. Interestingly, this watch has not yet started to bend downward on Chrono 24's numbers as of the end date of this snapshot. It's the only watch that hasn't done so. And the final one is the big one, the blue line, the Patek Nautilus 5711. It started our series in January 2019 at about $55,427. It's currently going for $196,365, and you can definitely see the bend down in that line. That is not its peak. So the reason why that graph obviously is so hard to read is we're using very different financial series in terms of just the scale. The S&P 500 is by far the smallest dollar amount we're dealing with, and then that Patek Nautilus is just so much higher than everything else we're looking at. It just makes it very hard to see everything on one graph because it zooms out so much. So let's not just focus on the dollar amounts, though I find them helpful to give a sense of scale. Let's look at percent change. So here's a new graph. And this time, we're just looking at the percent change from the prior month of the S&P 500 monthly average and these three luxury watches. Now, important to bear in mind, the zero value, it is here. You can see it. The lines are kind of hugging it by and large. But notice that I do have numbers above 0% going up to 30%. And I have numbers below going down to negative 20%. And the reason is Sometimes values go up and sometimes values go down, and we need to reflect all of that in order for you to understand the full picture here. I think we have three main points of interest. The first would be March 2020. You can see the S&P 500 really dipped down there. It's the dashed yellow line. I made it dashed so it stands out a little bit easier. And it had a loss of over 19% versus February 2020. Now, the reason for this, for those that don't recall, is that was when a lot of the stay-at-home orders and the initial concerns about COVID-19 took effect. And there were a lot of thoughts that we might have to stay locked down for a considerable period of time, and the markets responded accordingly. Obviously, that dip did not last very long, and as you can see from the other lines representing the watch values, we did not see the same impact on watch pricing. Now, that's not to say there wasn't an impact. In fact, the following month, April 2020, we actually saw the Royal Oak go down 0.4% and the Daytona go down 0.5%. So I think there was a little bit of market response, but it's difficult to say. The Patek went up 0.2% around the same time, but that said, it had just dropped 1.7% in March of 2020. It actually did dip down below. And that's something that actually, if you were to go through the individual months, there were declines. Everything wasn't always just going up until recently. There were occasional declines in all three of these watches, especially in 2020, usually fairly small percentiles, though we did see a little bit more fluctuation, I would say, in the Nautilus 5711 versus the others. And that might be because the Nautilus 5711 just seems to be more speculative in general, even compared to these other two, which are, I think, fairly defined as hype watches. But the other 2 points of data interest, I think, are the 5711, the Patek Nautilus, had a big spike February 2021. It went up over 30% from the prior month, which of course is very significant. And then we can see around the final point affects all three of the watches, even though we started to see a dip in the market of the S&P 500. And that's at that February 2022 data point. And we will look at another graph to better examine that. So here's the same graph as before. I've just cropped out all of that information from 2019 and 2020, and in fact, most of 2021, because I really wanted to examine this particular spike. So here, the data range is September of 2021 through May of 2022, and you can see that the performance, the percentage change month to month, not too particularly shocking between anything until we get to the start of this year, 2022. So we started to see a decline in January of 2022 of the S&P 500. It fell versus December by 2.2%, and then it fell again the following month by 3% versus where it was at in January. And I've left those data labels here to make it a little bit easier to see. Then you can see, though, that was not the same behavior as the watch pricing. So at the same time frame versus December, in January, the Rolex Daytona went up 7.8%, and then in February, it went up versus January another 13.6%. I do not have the labeling marked here for the Royal Oak on the graph because I thought it was starting to get a little too cluttered, but so you know exactly what it is, the January 2022 watch pricing on Chrono 24 for that Royal Oak went up versus December by 10.9%. And then in February, it went up 22.3%. So again, pretty significant spikes, and you can definitely see it on the graph. And then, of course, leading the pack on percent change, just like it was leading the pack on dollars, is that 5711 Nautilus. In January of 2022, it had gone up 23% from the prior month. And then February went up 32.3% more than where it was at in January. Obviously, the S&P 500's changes did not support these price increases on these three watches in any way. As you can see, it was clearly going downward at the time. But after that, increasing fell off. And this is where, again, it's important to stress, this is a percent change graph. So bear in mind where the lines are above zero and where they're below zero. So in March, looking at the orange line, and again, I don't have the data labels on anything at this point other than one more snapshot on the 5711, but in case you're curious, so March versus February, that Royal Oak went up again. Just, you see the line has gone down because it didn't go up as much. It went up 6.8%. And then April versus March went up another 0.8%. And then the data as of this month, May 2022, it went up. Again, it looks like it's at zero, but it was actually 0.4% up. So this watch has still actually been going up. It just all of a sudden it isn't going up nearly as much. Now, that is not the same case for the Rolex Daytona. For this Rolex Daytona reference number, March went up 8.4%. So you can see the line still above zero, but it's not nearly as bad as it was prior, which again was 13.6%, as you can see labeled on the graph. Then April's change was up 1.6%. And then, as we've discussed in other videos, it started to fall. May, on Chrono 24, it's currently down 2%. But the most significant level of change we've seen has been in the 5711. And again, as you can see on the graph, it went up 32% versus where it was at in January for February 2022. However, March 2022 did not go up less. It actually fell in value. That dot is just below the zero. It fell in March by 1.3% versus where it was going in February. Then April, that one I have labeled, you can see the loss of 11.1%. And then May, even though the dot is higher, it's still below the zero. It fell another 5.1% in May versus what it was selling for on Chrono 24 in April. So what does it all mean? And let me go ahead and put back up the full percent change graph going back to our pre-pandemic examination period. As you can see, we have had some hiccups where these are not all hugging the line together, but by and large, it looks like things generally aren't too extremely different versus what we've seen in the S&P 500. There are differences, and month by month, there are instances where the S&P 500 may have gone down, but the watch values went up, or we might see that the S&P 500 went up by a higher percentage than the watch values did, but everything went up. Or again, especially when you look at that 2020 timeframe, there are a number of instances after that snapshot in March of 2020 where the S&P fell by so much, where the watches had some times where they actually lost values, multiple months where they went down versus the prior month, at least in terms of what was listed on Chrono 24. But the most interesting thing, of course, is the aspect of what's been happening here as we reach what we hope to be the tail end of the pandemic. And putting back up that closer examination graph, the behavior of these watches earlier this year was just ridiculous. I think one could argue it's been ridiculous for quite a while in the pandemic in terms of just how much speculation has been going on some of these hype watches. But as the market started to slide and these other watches going up, it just did not make any sense. And we've seen that the valuation has started to come down, at least on two of these three. Again, the Royal Oak just stopped going up as much. It will be interesting to see when we have another month or two's worth of data if this Royal Oak model has started to actually go down in price as well. I think it will. I just think everything else is pointing to the fact that that's the way the market's going. But for those that were curious about where things stood, we did see increases, of course, throughout this entire time frame, very, very large dollar amount changes for all of these watches. I mean, again, we're talking about 2019 values of $55,000 for a Nautilus, and it's now $196,000. And the Royal Oak was a $18,900 watch, and now it's a $74,700 watch. And the Daytona, again, $20,700 back in January 2019, and now it's $45,800. But a lot of that increasing was relatively gradual up until 2021, where we started to see a lot more significant changes, and then the absolute ridiculous spiking that we saw here in January and February of 2022. The market just didn't support it. I think this correction was probably inevitable, especially given what's happening with the stock market. And given we don't expect to see a bull market in the foreseeable future for stocks, and the S&P 500 is a really good index for stocks overall, I think these watch prices will continue to slide, as I've been saying for a few weeks now. So anyway, well, that'll be it for this video. If you have any thoughts on my analysis or want to share your thoughts on what's going on with the market or these watches or other watches that I didn't cover, obviously I didn't want to overcrowd the graph, but please comment below with your thoughts. I'd appreciate that. And if you enjoyed the video, do give it a like. And otherwise, I'll talk to y'all on the next one.